In the biting winter of 1943, amidst the jagged peaks of the occupied Luxembourg Ardennes, an elderly widow stood before her hearth and ignited a fire that would incinerate the vanguard of the Third Reich. Her name was Elise Van der Meer, a 70-year-old with lungs rasped by soot and a spirit forged in the ancestral stone of her hillside farmhouse. To the local patrols, she was a ghost of the past. To the Allied High Command, she was the most lethal navigator in the European theater. Every dawn, as the mist clung to the valley of Clairvaux, Elise would tend her flame, but the plumes drifting from her towering stone chimney were not for warmth. They were a silent 500-foot-tall visual GPS written in chemical hues, dark sulfurous blacks and thick peat whites, guiding Lancaster bombers to the exact heart of Nazi munitions. The Germans never suspected that the frail woman boiling tea was the architect behind 19 decimated supply hubs and the wreckage of their invincible Tiger tanks. This is the history they buried, the account of a chimney phantom who turned a domestic chore into a tactical masterclass. Before the panzers shattered the silence of her village in 1940, Elise's life was defined by the quiet rhythm of the soil. She had spent 40 years alongside her husband, Bram, raising livestock until the war claimed him and saw her grandson stolen for forced labor. Left with a hollow home and a tall chimney that dominated the ridgeline, Elise refused to watch the world burn in silence. She realized the Allied pilots were flying blind, dropping payloads into empty forests. They needed a beacon. By mastering the alchemy of wet birch and coal, Elise transformed her home into a landmark of death for the occupiers, deciding that if her life was to end, it would be as the spark that lit the fuse of liberation.
The occupation arrived with the cold efficiency of a slaughterhouse. One morning in May 1940, Elise awoke to birdsong and the smell of fresh bread from the village bakery. By evening, swastika banners hung from the town hall and German voices barked orders in the square. The Wehrmacht rolled through Clairvaux like a steel tide, cataloging every asset, requisitioning every resource, posting guards at every intersection. Within days, the village that had stood for 8 centuries became a cog in the machine of the Third Reich. Elise's grandsons were taken in the first wave of conscriptions. Peter and Klaus, 17 and 19, were dragged from their beds at dawn and loaded onto trucks bound for labor battalions in the east. She watched from her doorway as they disappeared down the mountain road, their faces pressed against the canvas flaps, calling her name until the distance swallowed their voices. The soldiers left her a receipt for 2 able-bodied workers, as if her grandsons were livestock. She folded the paper carefully and placed it in her Bible next to her husband's funeral card. She would not forget. Her farmhouse occupied the highest point on the ridgeline, a 3-story fortress of local granite built by her grandfather in 1870. The chimney rose nearly 60 feet, engineered by her late husband Bram to create a draft so powerful it could pull smoke cleanly even during the worst winter gales. The design had been his pride, a marvel of practical engineering. Now, surrounded by enemies and stripped of family, Elise found herself alone with that towering chimney and a clear view of everything the Germans wanted hidden. She began to notice patterns in the occupation. Supply convoys moved east on Tuesday mornings, always before dawn. Fuel tankers returned empty on Thursday afternoons. Guard rotations at the hidden munitions depot in the northern forest clearing happened every 6 hours, like clockwork.
The Germans were efficient, predictable, and arrogant. They believed the local population was beaten. That resistance meant men with guns hiding in the woods. They never imagined it could mean an old woman with a fireplace and a memory sharper than their reconnaissance. The incident that changed everything happened on September 13, 1942. Elise was feeding her chickens when she heard the drone of engines high above. Allied bombers appeared in tight formation, their contrails scratching white lines across the blue autumn sky. She watched them approach, felt a surge of hope, and then heard the whistle of falling ordnance. The bombs fell in a diagonal line that missed the munitions depot entirely and obliterated the village church instead. The explosion threw her to the ground. When the dust cleared, 12 civilians lay dead in the rubble, including the baker's wife and her 3 children. The Germans laughed as they surveyed the damage, joking about Allied incompetence. The resistance members who survived wept in rage and frustration, and Elise, staring up at her chimney as smoke from the burning church drifted across the valley, felt something crystallize in her chest, an idea so audacious it bordered on madness. The pilots couldn't see their targets, but they could see smoke, and she had the tallest chimney in 50 kilometers. Elise had lived 70 years on this land. She knew its seasons, its moods, its materials. She knew that wet peat from the bog near the eastern pasture produced thick white smoke that hung in cold air like a banner. She knew the sulfurous coal from the old Edelbrook seam burned with dark, oily plumes that stained the sky. She knew birch bark layered with pine resin created smoke so black it looked like a storm cloud. What she didn't know was whether anyone would notice, or if noticing would matter. Her first experiments were crude and desperate. She built a fire using damp straw and watched the smoke column rise before dissipating within minutes. The second attempt used compacted peat soaked overnight in a barrel, producing a plume that held its shape for nearly half an hour, visible across the entire valley. She timed it to coincide with distant aircraft engines she heard passing overhead. Nothing happened. But she wasn't discouraged. She was learning, calibrating, understanding the language of combustion and atmosphere. The breakthrough came from an unexpected angel. On a freezing November night, Elise heard scratching at her barn door. She found a young man collapsed in the hay, his RAF uniform torn and bloody, his left leg shattered below the knee. Thomas Caverly, navigator of a Lancaster bomber shot down during the Trier raid, had crawled 15 kilometers through enemy territory to reach the first isolated building he could find. Elise dragged him into her root cellar, bound his wounds with strips of torn bedding, and fed him broth in the darkness while German patrols searched the roads outside. For 2 weeks, Caverly hid in that cellar while his legs slowly healed. Elise brought him food, water, and news from the resistance network. In return, he answered her questions about how bombers found their targets at night. He explained the nightmare of navigating over blacked-out Europe, where the landscape below was an abyss punctuated by occasional fires that could be anything: burning farms, forest fires, German decoys designed to draw bombs away from real installations. The Luftwaffe had learned to light dummy fires in empty fields, causing Allied bombers to waste their payloads on nothing. "What we need," Caverly told her in his cramped hiding place, "is markers we can trust. Signals that appear at specific coordinates at specific times in patterns the Germans can't replicate. If we had that, we could coordinate entire raids around a single beacon." He said it wistfully, as if describing an impossible dream. Elise looked at the cellar ceiling, at the stone foundation of her chimney rising through the floors above, and smiled. "What if I told you I could give you that beacon?"
Over the next 10 days, Caverly taught Elise a signaling system born of desperation and ingenuity. They couldn't use anything electronic. The Germans had detection equipment that could triangulate radio signals within minutes. They needed something analog, visible, and deniable. Smoke was perfect because it was ubiquitous. Every farmhouse had a chimney. Every chimney produced smoke. The trick was making that smoke speak. They developed a crude but effective code. A single sustained plume meant target directly north of smoke source. Two separate columns, created by banking the fire and restarting it, meant target east. Dark smoke followed immediately by white meant precision bombing required, civilians nearby. A spiral pattern, achieved by partially blocking the chimney and releasing it in intervals, meant abort, enemy fighters active. Caverly drew diagrams on scraps of paper showing her the bombing routes, the altitudes, the visual angles pilots would use. They practiced at night when the patrols were lightest. Elise would build fires in specific sequences while Caverly watched through a crack in the barn door, timing the smoke's visibility and duration. She learned to control the density by adjusting moisture content. She learned to change colors by mixing different combustibles. She learned that temperature mattered, that wind direction could be compensated for, that even the time of day affected how far the smoke could be seen. It was chemistry, meteorology, and art compressed into the simple act of tending a fire. The first operational signal went up on December 3, 1942. Intelligence from the local resistance confirmed that a convoy of Tiger tanks was staging at the forest depot, preparing to move east. The target was valuable but small, hidden beneath camouflage netting that made it invisible from the air. At precisely 2100 hours, Elise built a fire using wet peat layered with pine pitch and birch bark.
The smoke that rose was boned white and textured like wool, visible even under a quarter moon, rising straight up in the still air like a pillar supporting the sky. At 2140 hours, she heard the engines. 12 Lancaster bombers appeared in formation, flying lower than usual, clearly searching for something. They didn't circle or hesitate. They followed the smoke directly to its source and then adjusted their course north by exactly 3 kilometers. The bombs fell in a perfect bracket. The forest depot erupted in a chain of explosions that turned the night orange. She watched from her window as Tiger tanks, the most feared armor in the Wehrmacht's arsenal, were reduced to burning scrap. German soldiers scrambled in panic, firing uselessly at the sky, never once looking toward the farmhouse on the ridge where an old woman stood silhouetted against her hearth. Caverly left 2 days later, smuggled out through resistance channels that would eventually return him to England. Before he went, he pressed a hand-drawn chart into her palm, showing bomber routes, target priorities, and communication protocols. He also gave her a warning that she would remember for the rest of her life. "They'll figure it out eventually, Elise. The Germans aren't stupid. When they realize what you're doing, they'll come for you." She folded the chart carefully and placed it in her Bible, between the Book of Judges and the Book of Ruth. She had already made her peace with the cost. Between December 1942 and October 1943, Elise Van der Meer became the deadliest woman in occupied Europe without firing a single shot. She orchestrated 19 successful bombing raids that destroyed railway hubs, supply convoys, fuel depots, ammunition dumps, and hidden artillery positions. Each strike was a masterpiece of timing and preparation, requiring hours of work gathering materials, treating them to precise specifications, and then maintaining fires with the attention of a symphony conductor.
Her methods evolved with terrifying efficiency. She learned to create yellow-tinged smoke using sulfur compounds scraped from old mining equipment. She discovered that damp oak produced gray spirals that stayed coherent in high winds. She found that certain combinations of materials could create nearly invisible vapor trails that still marked positions for pilots using specialized optics. Every signal was different, adapted to weather conditions, target type, and the specific bomber crews assigned to the mission. The work destroyed her body. The chronic lung condition she developed from decades of coal smoke in the house accelerated into something vicious. Every breath was a battle. She coughed blood into rags that she immediately burned to hide the evidence. Her hands became scarred from handling hot iron tools and caustic materials. She lost weight until her clothes hung on her frame like funeral shrouds. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Every plume of smoke was a message to her grandsons, wherever they were. Your grandmother is still fighting. The Germans began to notice after the 7th strike. A memo circulated among Wehrmacht intelligence officers noting the statistically anomalous accuracy of Allied bombing in the Clairvaux sector.
After the 12th strike, they launched a manhunt for resistance operatives with radio equipment, tearing apart farmhouses and interrogating villagers under the harsh lights of the local garrison. They found nothing, because there was nothing electronic to find. They were hunting for technology in an age when their enemy was using methods that predated the telegraph. By the 15th strike, paranoia infected the German command. Officers accused each other of being spies. They executed 3 local men suspected of signaling with lanterns, though no evidence was ever produced. They installed radio detection equipment on every hill, rotating patrols increased to random schedules, and they even brought in Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes to photograph the region from the air. Still, the bombings continued with impossible precision. It was as if the Allies could see through walls, as if they had a guardian angel hovering over the Ardennes, whispering coordinates directly into their ears. Colonel Hans-Dieter Gruen arrived in Clairvaux on March 15, 1943, with a reputation that preceded him like a shadow. A former mathematics professor from Heidelberg turned Abwehr counterintelligence officer, Gruen had rooted out resistance networks across occupied France using statistical analysis and game theory. He believed every secret left a signature. Every pattern revealed its source. The Wehrmacht High Command sent him with a single mandate: find the invisible enemy destroying their supply lines or be sent to the Eastern Front. Gruen set up his headquarters in the commandeered mayor's office and immediately began his work with the methodical precision of a dissection. He collected bombing logs, weather reports, patrol schedules, and casualty assessments. He plotted every strike on a large map using colored pins and string, creating a web of connections that covered an entire wall. He interviewed survivors, studied the blast patterns, calculated the angles of approach. For 6 weeks, he found nothing. The data refused to cohere into meaning. Then came the incident that changed his thinking. On a rainy April afternoon, Gruen stood on the balcony of his headquarters smoking a cigarette and studying the ridgeline through binoculars. He noticed smoke rising from a farmhouse at the highest elevation, thick and unusually white, holding its shape despite the wind gusting through the valley. He noted the time, 1740 hours. That night, at 1820 hours, Allied bombers appeared and destroyed a camouflaged ammunition train sitting in a railway tunnel 4 kilometers northeast of the smoke's origin point. Gruen felt the pieces click together with the satisfying precision of a mathematical proof. Not radio signals, not spies with electronic transmitters, not coded messages or hidden operatives, Smoke signals. Primitive, analog, invisible to modern detection equipment because they weren't modern at all. He almost laughed at the audacity of it. The Allies were using technology that predated the Roman Empire to dismantle the most sophisticated military machine in human history. He began mapping every chimney in the region. There were hundreds of farmhouses, but only one sat at an elevation high enough to be visible from bomber altitude while aligning perfectly with the strike patterns. The Van der Meer property. Gruen studied it through his binoculars for days. He saw an old woman feeding chickens, hanging laundry, moving with the painful slowness of advanced age. She looked like someone's grandmother, harmless and fading. He almost dismissed her. But his instinct, the same instinct that had identified patterns others missed, told him she was exactly what he was looking for. Gruen's surveillance was patient and surgical. He assigned observers to watch the farmhouse in rotating shifts, logging every activity, every visitor, every plume of smoke from the chimney. He cross-referenced the smoking patterns with Allied bombing activity and found what he already suspected: near-perfect correlation. When the chimney produced sustained white smoke, bombers appeared within 2 hours. When it stayed cold, the skies remained empty. The Van der Meer woman was either the luckiest person in Europe or the most dangerous. But Gruen needed proof. He couldn't arrest a 70-year-old widow on circumstantial evidence without making himself look paranoid and incompetent. He needed to catch her in the act, to have witnesses and documentation that would satisfy his superiors. So he did what all good hunters do. He set a trap. Elise knew she was being watched. She saw the way patrol patterns changed, soldiers lingering near her property line with binoculars. She noticed the same faces in the village asking careful questions about her health, her habits, her visitors. She saw Colonel Gruen standing on his balcony every evening, his field glasses trained on her roof, like a man studying a puzzle. The noose was tightening, and she had always known this moment would come. The resistance brought her increasingly desperate intelligence. A massive Panzer Reserve was assembling in the valley, preparing for a counteroffensive designed to crush the Allied advance through the Ardennes. It was the largest concentration of armor in the sector, hidden beneath acres of camouflage netting in 3 separate locations. If those tanks deployed, they would slaughter thousands. If they could be destroyed before deployment, the entire German defensive line would collapse. The Allies were planning an operation they called Hammer Blow, a coordinated strike requiring navigation so precise it would be impossible without her signal. But there was a problem. Gruen had scheduled routine inspections of all ridge properties for the exact evening of the planned raid. Elise would have to maintain her most complex signal yet while German soldiers stood in her home, potentially watching her work. It was suicide. The resistance offered to extract her, to smuggle her out before the operation. She refused. "I didn't start this to run when it mattered most," she told them. "Get me the materials I need." If you believe courage isn't measured by strength, but by sacrifice, hit that subscribe button. People like Gruen won't, and you need to hear what she did about it. October 19, 1943, dawned cold and clear, the kind of day where smoke would be visible for 50 kilometers. Elise began her preparations before sunrise, moving through the rituals that had become sacred over 10 months of signals. She soaked bales of peat in her bathtub until they were dense as clay, their moisture content calibrated by weight and feel. She mixed sulfur powder with coal dust in ceramic bowls, creating compounds that would burn with specific colors, visible even at altitude. She split birch logs and coated them with rendered animal fat, preparing fuel that would produce thick, rolling clouds. By afternoon, her kitchen looked like an alchemist's laboratory. Materials were staged in precise order, each substance labeled with a piece of chalk on the hearthstone, showing when to add it and how much. The timing had to be perfect. The Allied bombers were coming in 3 waves over 60 minutes, each wave targeting a different section of the Panzer Reserve. Her signal would guide them in sequence, shifting from white to gray to black to mark each target zone. It was the most complex message she had ever attempted, and she would have to do it while maintaining the illusion of innocent domesticity. At 1900 hours, she lit the fire. The initial plume was pure white, achieved with wet peat compressed into blocks. It rose straight up into the darkening sky, a pillar visible from the German observation posts and, she hoped, from the approaching bombers. She fed it carefully, maintaining the color and density, her movements automatic from months of practice. Her lungs protested with every breath, her hands shook from exhaustion and disease, but her mind was clear. At 1920 hours, she heard boots on her porch. The knock was polite, almost apologetic. Frau Van der Meer, routine inspection ordered by Colonel Gruen. She opened the door to find 4 Wehrmacht soldiers and the colonel himself, his gray eyes studying her with predatory intelligence. "May we come in?" "Of course, Colonel," Elise said, her voice perfectly modulated to match her appearance, elderly, confused, harmless. "Though I must apologize for the state of the house, I'm just an old woman trying to stay warm. The winters are harder at my age."
The soldiers spread through her home like ants, checking rooms, opening cabinets, looking under furniture. One young corporal even poked his head into the cellar where Caverly had hidden months before. They found nothing suspicious, because there was nothing to find. The materials for her signals looked like ordinary fuel. The staging looked like the preparations of someone rationing their resources. Only Gruen seemed unconvinced. He walked directly to the hearth where the fire blazed with obvious intensity. He stared at the flames, then at the chimney, then at Elise with an expression that mixed respect and rage. "You burn very hot for someone rationing coal, Frau Van der Meer. I've been saving scraps all season. I don't go into the village much anymore. At my age, the cold is more dangerous than hunger." She coughed for effect, a wet rattling sound that wasn't entirely performance. Gruen crouched beside the fire and examined the fuel. He saw the layered materials, the unnatural consistency of the peat blocks, the way the smoke rising through the chimney seemed almost purposeful in its density. Outside, the first rumble of bomber engines echoed across the valley. His body went rigid. He stood and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain. The sky was full of them. Lancaster bombers in formation, dozens of aircraft flying lower than usual, their bomb bay doors already open. They weren't searching. They were following something. Gruen turned back to Elise, his face pale with understanding. "It's you. It's been you all along." Elise said nothing. She simply moved to the fire and added another block of peat, maintaining the signal as the first wave of bombers passed overhead. They dragged her to Gruen's headquarters and threw her into a stone cell that smelled of mildew and old fear. The interrogation began at dawn. Gruen was professional, almost respectful in his approach, asking questions with the precision of a surgeon making incisions. "How long have you been signaling? How many operations? Who taught you the methods? Who else is involved?" He wanted to understand not just what she had done, but how she had done it, because understanding was the only way to prevent it from happening again. Elise gave him nothing.
She deployed the perfect weapon of the elderly, selective confusion. She misunderstood questions, rambled about her late husband and the farm in better days, pretended her hearing was failing. She was simultaneously too fragile to be a threat and too addled to provide useful information. It was a performance refined over 70 years of living in a world that underestimated women, and especially old women. Gruen recognized the act for what it was, which made it even more frustrating. "I know what you did," he said on the third day, his voice tight with exhaustion. "I know about the smoke signals. I know about the 19 operations. I know you guided Allied bombers to their targets with primitive chemistry and a tall chimney. What I don't know is why. Why would you sacrifice yourself for a war that will be over soon anyway? The Reich will win. This changes nothing." Elise looked at him with eyes that had watched her world burn and smiled. "My grandsons were taken by your Reich, Colonel. Peter and Klaus. They were boys who had never hurt anyone. You took them and sent them to die building your fortifications. You tell me the war will be over soon, that your Reich will win. I say that even if you're right, even if you conquer the entire world, you'll still have lost, because you'll spend the rest of your lives wondering which grandmother, which old man, which child you dismissed is the one writing your death warrant in smoke, in code, in whispers. You've already lost. You just don't know it yet." Gruen had no response. He left the cell and didn't return. But Elise could hear something he apparently could not: the distant rumble of artillery, growing steadily closer each day, the sound of liberation approaching like thunder on the horizon. The village of Clairvaux was liberated on November 8, 1943, by advancing American forces of the 28th Infantry Division. They fought their way through the valley in bitter combat, finding German resistance significantly weakened by the destruction of the Panzer Reserve. When they reached the garrison headquarters, they discovered Elise Van der Meer in a cell barely large enough to stand, unconscious and barely breathing, her lungs ravaged beyond any hope of full recovery. They carried her to a field hospital where army doctors worked to stabilize her condition. When she finally woke, she found herself surrounded by officers from Allied intelligence who had traveled specifically to meet her. They brought the reports from RAF Bomber Command, the assessments from field commanders, the photographs of the destruction her signals had enabled. The numbers were staggering. 19 successful operations, over 400 armored vehicles destroyed, 13 ammunition dumps eliminated, supply lines disrupted for months, an estimated 1,200 civilian lives saved by preventing the indiscriminate carpet bombing that would have been necessary without her precision guidance. "You won the war for us," one American colonel told her, though they both knew it was hyperbole born of gratitude. She hadn't won the war, but she had changed its course in her small corner of occupied Europe, and that was enough. Elise spent her final months in that field hospital, accepting visitors from resistance groups, Allied commanders, and eventually journalists who wanted to document her story. She described her methods with the same practical precision she had used to execute them: the moisture content of peat, the burning temperature of different coals, the way wind patterns at altitude affected smoke dispersal. She made it sound simple, because to her, it had been simple. Not easy, but simple. You identified what needed to be done, and you did it, regardless of the cost. Her grandsons returned in January 1944, both still alive, both forever changed by their time in German labor camps. They sat at her bedside and wept as she told them what she had done, how every signal was a message meant for them. your grandmother never stopped fighting. She died on February 14, 1944, with Peter and Klaus holding her hands, surrounded by the officers and pilots who owed their lives to her smoke. The pilots of the 617th Squadron collected funds to install a bronze plaque at the base of her chimney. It was mounted on the stone foundation 3 months after her death during a ceremony attended by local resistance members and RAF personnel. The plaque reads simply, Elise Van der Meer, 1873-1944. She turned smoke into thunder. Colonel Hans-Dieter Gruen was captured during the liberation and spent the remainder of the war in a POW camp in England. During his debriefing, Allied intelligence officers asked him how it felt to be outmaneuvered by an elderly widow. His answer was recorded in the official transcripts and later declassified. I spent my career hunting revolutionaries, saboteurs, and trained agents. I developed methods to detect radio signals, decrypt codes, and track resistance networks. But I never thought to look at a grandmother with a bucket of coal and a fireplace. That oversight wasn't just mine, it was the fundamental flaw in everything the Reich represented. We believed power came from technology, from force, from the machinery of modern warfare. She proved that power comes from will, from sacrifice, from the refusal to accept defeat even when defeat seems certain. That was my failure. That was all of our failures. And that's why we lost. The story of Elise Van der Meer remained classified for nearly 20 years. The British government didn't want to publicize methods that might be replicated in future conflicts, and they were protective of intelligence sources that had contributed to her success. But in 1963, as part of a general declassification of World War II documents, RAF files revealed the extent of her contribution. Historians studying the liberation of Luxembourg began to understand that the seemingly miraculous accuracy of Allied bombing in the Clairvaux sector wasn't luck or superior intelligence. It was one woman with a tall chimney and the knowledge to use it. Her farmhouse still stands on the ridgeline overlooking the valley. The building is now a small museum dedicated to irregular resistance during the occupation. Visitors come from across Europe to see the hearth where she worked, the tools she used, the hand-drawn charts she kept hidden in her Bible. The rooms have been preserved as they were, down to the scorch marks on the hearthstone where different materials burned at different temperatures. On the anniversary of her death each year, park rangers light a ceremonial fire using the same methods Elise once employed. They follow her notes exactly. Wet peat from the eastern bog, sulfurous coal from Edelbrook, birch bark with pine resin. The smoke rises thick and white, visible for miles across the valley, a reminder that reaches into the sky like a monument. It is a testament to the truth that war is not won only by generals and armies, by tanks and bombers, by the machinery of industrial slaughter. It is won by the invisible, the underestimated, the ones the enemy never thought to fear. Elise Van der Meer was 70 years old when she began her campaign. She was widowed, dying, physically frail, and possessed of no weapons beyond her ancestral home and her absolute refusal to surrender to evil. She turned smoke into a language. She turned her fireplace into a command center. She turned herself into the most dangerous woman in occupied Europe, orchestrating destruction with nothing more than combustible materials and an understanding of chemistry learned through a lifetime of practical living. And the Nazis, with all their technology, all their intelligence apparatus, all their sophisticated detection equipment, never saw her coming
until the bombs were already falling. They dismissed her because she was old, because she was a woman, because she appeared harmless. That dismissal was their biggest mistake. By the time they understood what she was, she had already rewritten the rules of their war and illuminated the path to their defeat. The last entry in her diary, written 3 days before her death, reads, "They asked me if I was afraid when I started the signals. I told them, no. Fear is for people who have something left to lose. I had already lost everything that mattered. All that remained was deciding whether I would die quietly or die making sure they remembered my name. I chose thunder. The chimney still stands, the smoke still rises, and the memory of what one grandmother accomplished with fire and fury continues to burn."